Hi, as we prepare to enter into Luke 24, I want to offer this introductory video to cover some of the many issues that are necessary to look at in interpreting Luke 24, as you can see on the right side of the screen. And first I just want to go through the list, and then we'll go back and look at some of them in detail now, and some of them we'll look at in detail as we go. There are also many more specific issues around the actual text of Luke and interpreting it, and we'll look at those, of course, as we go too. But first of all, as you can see on the right side of the screen, the first question is the relation between Luke 24 and the other Gospels' tomb/resurrection stories. And as we'll see, they're very different. So to the extent that we see Luke as a synoptic gospel along with Matthew and Mark, and very different from John, we'll see how that's challenged here in this chapter. Number two, what were contemporary understandings of what happens at death, Jewish/biblical or Greco-Roman? Now, this is important because resurrection is one of those things that's just not the ordinary set of events. We've been through the chapters on crucifixion, and although crucifixion isn't normal to us today, it was normal enough in the ancient world, and certainly state execution is normal enough even to this day. So there's nothing that requires God's intervention or a special way of thinking to understand what crucifixion is. But resurrection is different. So we're going to have to look at what are some of the common understandings of what happens at death, and recognize as we do that what we have are the records of the elite of philosophers and people like that and poets, but what ordinary people on the ground thought might be very different. Just as today you could read what officials in churches say, but when you ask people on the ground, they may have very different views. So we'll try to look at a little of both of those. Number three, what are the Hebrew Scripture passages behind the hope for resurrection? And that's different than the question of what are the Hebrew Scripture passages behind what we hear from the narrator in the Road to Emmaus story, that Jesus, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, interpreted the passages of Scripture that referred to him or were about him, depending on the translation. We'll look at that when we get to the Road to Emmaus story. But this is the bigger question of whether resurrection was something completely out of nowhere or whether it was expected or not. Then we're going to look at how Luke 24 shapes the entire story of Luke's gospel as a hinge before we get to Acts of the Apostles, by fulfilling, in quotes there, because the word fulfilled will be used, and it was used in chapter 1, it'll be used here in chapter 24, the hopes expressed in those first two chapters. And we'll see how it's been transformed as well. Number five, does it matter if the resurrection of Jesus, quote-unquote, really happened? And one of my premises for interpretation throughout is that we can't answer the question of whether Jesus said or did any particular thing. Scholars who make whatever efforts they can to try to prove it end up getting nowhere, as far as I can tell, arguing with each other and not reaching any clarity other than counting the number of scholars who agree with them. So with any text from the past, it's almost impossible to know, quote, what really happened, unless we're there, for all the kinds of reasons historians and literary critics understand about the relationship between storytelling and physical reality out there. But the resurrection of Jesus is, of course, a different category of experience. And so for skeptics or for people who have their minds shaped by the Enlightenment, starting with people like Thomas Jefferson, who excised everything from the Bible that he thought smacked of miracle and turned it into a rational teaching document, a resurrection is certainly in that category. So if you're in that category and you think resurrection can't happen, does it matter? Why or why not? Just number six, at the narrative level, apart from the question of whether it could really happen, what does Luke's narrative suggest is the nature of a quote-unquote risen body? And we'll see that it's not a spirit or a ghost, and it's physical in some way, and yet on the road to Emmaus, they see this person and don't think it's anything but a person, but somehow he does not recognize as Jesus. So we'll look at some of the evidence of what a risen body might be like or not like. And number seven, are there Jewish and or Jewish political implications of proclaiming Jesus is risen? And one reason that's important is until very recently, most scholars have seen Luke acts as an apology to the Romans or something similar for why the gospel or why Christians are not a threat to the Roman Empire. But recent scholarship has challenged that on a number of bases, but one of those is resurrection. And as we'll explore both today briefly and then more detail as we go, there's nothing more radically anti-imperial than claiming that empire does not have the last word when it comes to life and death. That God has power to raise from the dead suggests that God is more powerful than the emperor and the empire, and that's certainly political, as we'll see. So, number eight, does a resurrection, quote-unquote, validate or authorize titles for Jesus? Many people have seen, without really thinking it through necessarily, the resurrection is proof, so to speak, that Jesus is the Messiah or Son of God, etc. But is it? Is there something about being the Messiah, or being Son of God, or being the human one, often translated Son of Man, or being Lord, that would be associated with resurrection, or that resurrection is associated with validating God's authority to somebody in particular? So we'll have to explore that question. Number 9. How does Luke's doubly narrated ascension story, one version in 24:50 to 53 and one in Acts 1:9 to 11, relate to Jesus' resurrection? In other words, why does Jesus go beyond the other writers and not just say that the tomb was empty and Jesus is risen and people physically touched him, as at least we see in Matthew and John, if not in Mark, to go on to describe Jesus as physically going up into the sky and being promised to come back down again, and he narrates it twice, slightly differently, once in Luke, as we see, and once in Acts. So how do those relate, and what exactly does Luke's narrative suggest happened to Jesus after he was raised? Number 10, we need to look at the implications of how Luke's shaping of these stories suggests aspects of how the ecclesiae, which is to say the churches, would be organized or would act in the world. I prefer to use the word ecclesia singular, ecclesiae plural, rather than the English church or churches, because church carries so much baggage for many people of both the building and the institution, and ecclesiae for most people does not. And that's the literal word. I use that throughout my series on Radical Bible on the book of Revelation. But it also implies the literal meaning of the term called out, ecclesia, those who are called out, and I'm going to suggest called out of empire. And Paul's the one who uses that word, but it's implicit in the background. So how does the way Luke shape the story suggest aspects of how the ecclesia would be organized or would act? For example, does the women's witness give them authority? What about Peter? What about apostles? So is being a witness to the resurrection give you authority later? What if you weren't a witness to the resurrection like Paul? And that raises the question of how does Luke 24 relate to Paul's views on resurrection, and parenthetically Paul's views on his own authority, especially in 1 Corinthians 15:3-9. And many scholars have asked the question of whether Luke is somehow writing against Paul's views, which certainly seem to have been crystallized earlier, because Paul in his letter says he's passing on to the Corinthians what was already passed on to him. And whenever we think Luke or Acts are written, Paul's letter to the Corinthians and his experience that he's passing on is earlier than Luke's gospel. So we have to look at all those questions in some detail. If we don't, we're going to unconsciously probably rely on our presuppositions that are in our head. And my goal here, as much as anything else, is to get you to think through why you believe what you believe or why you interpret it as you do. So let's begin to look at some of the elements of what I prepared to help us go through some of these issues. First of all, we can look at the empty tomb in all four Gospels. And as you can see from what's in bold here, the parts that are in bold are unique to each Gospel. And almost everything is in bold. The only thing that's common to all four is this one phrase, the first day of the week. And the only other thing that's common to the so-called synoptic Gospels in green here is some version of he has been raised, he is not here, although it's not identical in each situation, and each time it's spoken by a different person. In Mark, by a young man dressed in a white robe. In Matthew, by an angel whose appearance is like lightning and clothing like snow. And in Luke, two men in dazzling clothes who say that same phrase. There's also a reference to Galilee, but in Mark and Matthew it's a reference ahead. He's gone ahead of you to Galilee, and in Luke it's remembering when he was still in Galilee. So Luke's version is very different. But not only that, Luke's entire rest of his story is very different. Let's look at it in two ways. Let's look at the frame here. The first part in 24:1-12 and the ending part in 24:36-50, and see the parallels there. And I've noted a couple of times both around the word for terrified and the word for disbelieving. We'll look at the Greek when we get there. It's only in these two places in all of Luke. But there's also these parallel phrases and things about remembering the things that Jesus said in the past, and the fact of their not believing, and the parallel between they remembered his words and he opened their minds. So these parts are parallel, and it also highlights how the road to Emmaus story in this complex chiasm, which is partly of my own devising, but partly of others, and you can see it goes A, B, C, D, E, F, all the way to the middle there, and we see clearly, you can see the parallels back and forth. So the road to Emmaus story is a chiasm, and because I've showed you here the parallels, we can really see the entire chapter, 50-verse chapter, is one big chiasm with this part and that part matching and that part there. And so that shape holds it all together, even though scholars tend to see three separate stories. The other thing that holds these parts together is in Jerusalem, and it's the same more or less group of people, the women and the apostles, as opposed to the two on the road to Emmaus. What about contemporary understandings of what happens at death? we can see some of the Greek ones here, and note that all of these are from the elite, whether it's Homer or the poets or the philosophers. These are views that elite writers would have. So in Homer, inferred, of course, Homer not being a theologian, there are shades using the Greek skai, or ghosts using pasukai, in contrast to what we'll see in the New Revised Standard, when pneuma, the word for spirits, is translated as ghost, wrongly there, or phantoms, idola, living in a shadowy existence in the underworld known as Hades, and occasionally visible to the living. Many of the epic poets pictured ongoing life for the dead as quote-unquote normal, as doing the more or less the same things. It's in poetry, so whether they took that literally or not is hard to know. Very influential, especially on later Christian writers, as I highlighted in my book Empire Baptized, with Plato from the Greek perspective and Seneca as a Platonist from the Roman perspective around the immortality of what's known in English as the soul, pasuke. Notice the same word here, it's translated as ghost. Released from imprisonment in the body. And that has all kinds of implications for what the body means for followers of Jesus, etc. We won't get into all that now. The Stoics, who were a branch of that kind of philosophy, and Cicero was a Roman version of that, understood there to be a temporary life for the soul until the rebirth of the universe in a primitive fire. Other than this, some particularly virtuous ones who would experience unending joy among the stars. But there's no particular criteria for what makes some people so special that way. Whether that Cicero's influenced by Daniel 12 or not is hard to say, but it's certainly a separate issue than bodily resurrection, as we'll see. There's, of course, the tradition of the divination of emperors alongside gods and heroes brought up to Olympus, but that, of course, would just be for emperors. And in many ways, in Philippians, Paul's description of what happens to Jesus fits the apotheosis of an emperor, and perhaps that's what Luke has in mind with the ascension story, and we'll look at that. Epicureans like Lucretius had made satires on all this and mocked any sense of afterlife, and so there are also elites that thought you got to be kidding with all this stuff. And then there's the variety of popular views, and it's hard to know what most of those were, but whether they were Greek or Roman or Jewish or just other folks on the ground who didn't identify with any of those, and the large imperial traditions or the Jewish traditions, what combinations of magic and myth and traditions that people had. And I'm sure if you ask friends and neighbors around you wherever you live, if you can get people to answer, there might be a wide variety of views as well. But also interesting are Jewish views, and as this one writer, Rabbi Dan Cohn-Sherbach, in the book Resurrection Reconsidered from 1996, notes first the resurrection of Jesus, a Jewish view, and then he goes on to say, not on point but feeling the need to say it, why Jews have rejected Christian claims about Jesus. And it's interesting that he felt the need to add all that to a chapter in a book that's about resurrection. But he notes here, and this is a direct quote from him, despite such isolated incidences of the resurrection of the dead found in biblical and rabbinic sources, and we'll look at that when we get to that question, it was not until the early rabbinic period, which is to say after the time of the New Testament, that the doctrine of the general resurrection of the dead became a central feature of Jewish theology. I want to highlight that. What he's saying is Jews believed in a general resurrection, but it did not become a clear part of the tradition until after the time of the Gospels. Whether people believe that earlier or not, and the rabbis just hadn't written it down, is always hard to know about any of that tradition. He continues, all the Bible tells us about the hereafter is that the dead will continue to exist in a shadowy realm, in the Bible known as Sheol, in contrast to the Greek notion of Hades that we saw. The domain is referred to in various ways, and we don't need to look at all those details now. I'll post this at radicalbible.net, and you can look at the details for yourself. But then he goes on to list all these reasons why Jews have rejected Christian claims. And I want to know two things about it. He's one person, and he's not just saying, here's why I have rejected Christian claims. He's making a statement for all Jews everywhere. I'd like to highlight how imperialistic that kind of statement is, even though obviously as a rabbi he doesn't have the power of empire. Because just like with Christians, I would suggest it depends radically on which Jews you ask. Not only are there different groups of Jews formally in the sense of Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox, or Ultra-Orthodox, even within those categories, there are many different perspectives. Just like there were in Jesus' time. So that I highlight this because we have to be careful not to generalize that all Jews have these views. For example, I was raised Jewish and I did not reject Jesus for any of these reasons. I didn't even know about these things when I was a kid. I was just told we do it because Jews don't believe in Jesus. End of story. So it depends upon who he asked. But he asked the interesting question at the end, could such a man have been resurrection? Which is to say, from his perspective, a person who breaks many of the rules or is arrogant, could that be the kind of person who would be specially seen as virtuous to be privileged with resurrection? And we'll have to explore that question as we go. So continuing, how does Luke 24 fulfill the hopes expressed? I didn't look at number 3. I referred there to Daniel 12, and I'm going to just leave it there for now. The other one that's sometimes used is Ezekiel 37, but I'd like to suggest the vision of dry bones is not about resurrection, but a metaphorical passage about coming out of exile. But we'll look at that more closely when we get there. But the primary answer to this is Daniel 12, and again, we'll look at that more as we go. Let's look more closely at Luke 24 and Luke 1 and 2. And I won't go over this again. I'll post this at Radical Bible. We'll look at more of the details as we go. On the left side of the screen, you can see chapter 24 going through. And on the right side, we can see elements. There's one exception from chapter 3, but otherwise these are all from chapter 1 and 2. And we can see how much of it is not just a verbal connection, but thematic. The question of raising up, the question of remembering, the question of salvation or what your eyes have seen, the question of what redemption might look like, the role of angels, the question of believing in the words, in this case of an angel, or here in this case the words of Jesus, what the understanding of what the Messiah would be, the role of Jerusalem, what the way of peace is, what joy comes from, how they come to understanding, what salvation is in relation to forgiveness, and what the role of the Jerusalem temple is. And whatever all those hopes and expectations were in chapter 1 and 2, they're either fulfilled or transformed in the final chapters, as we'll see. So, does it matter if it happened or not? There's not, of course, an answer to that. All I can say is my view. Personally, yes, absolutely it matters, and I will stop there and say, but scholars obviously disagree. There are many scholars who see themselves as atheists, and they see themselves still as scholars. There are many who would see themselves as faithful, but don't believe in a physical resurrection. Just like many people who go to church may nod and wink if they recite the creed, but still not really believe in a physical resurrection. Ironically, perhaps a reason that Rabbi Cohn Scherbach suggested many Jews don't, because of the Enlightenment, because it just doesn't make sense to the modern mind. So not that it's something against being Jew or being a Christian, it's against the sense of being a rational Enlightenment thinker, that of course there's no such thing as resurrection. And all I would suggest is maybe there's more to heaven and earth than meets our eye. But that's a question you have to decide for yourself. The nature of the risen body we'll see as we go. I've already mentioned something about the political implication that to proclaim Jesus risen and that to go on proclaim it in Acts is exactly what will get them in trouble, and is the most subversive anti-imperial statement anybody could make. So any idea that Luke is not poking the empire in the nose with the resurrection of Jesus is really not reading carefully. Does it validate or authorize these titles? And the answer is flatly no, it does not. Being a Messiah, being Son of God, being a human, or being Lord, none of those had to do with rising from the dead. The only understanding of rising from the dead was the general sense we'd see in Daniel 12, that those who were wise, those who were faithful would rise to a resurrection of goodness, but the evil would rise also to a resurrection of judgment. So there's no sense of a specific resurrection, and certainly no sense that resurrection as an event would prove any of these titles. It certainly doesn't prove that Jesus is God, as many people suggest. Ironically, it proves that least because it's not something Jesus did to himself, but something God did to him. So in that case, it would separate him from God, that he couldn't do it to himself. It required external power, the power of God, to do it. The ascension story, again, we'll look at that more as we go, because whether it's the devil or God is in the details there. We'll have to look more closely at what Luke is saying, and there's literally whole books of essays written on that question, which I'll try to bring some of the best of it to us here. The ecclesiae question is really, really important. For example, as we saw here, Mary Magdalene is the main character here, and that makes her really important. Whereas Simon Peter and the unique character to John's Gospel, the so-called beloved disciple, walk away not having understood the Scripture, but only having believed Mary's witness. So the role of women will be really important, and as we'll see in Luke, there's no narration of Peter's experience, just a report of Peter's experience. So does that affect Peter's authority, unlike in Matthew, where The Jesus before he dies gives Peter the power of the rock, so to speak. We don't have that in Luke, so we'll have to look at that some more. And what about Paul? Does Paul have authority in Luke's mind when he wasn't a witness of the resurrection? He certainly claims that he's an apostle, but would Luke see it the same way? Would Jesus see it that way? It doesn't matter. And then finally, again, we'll look at the contrast, if there is one, between what we can infer about Luke's views on resurrection in chapter 24 and in Acts 1 a little bit, and in 1 Corinthians 5. So those are some of the issues we have to begin to get into, and next video we'll jump right into the empty tomb, so to speak. See you then for that. Bye-bye.